The year is 1098. You are trapped behind walls with 300 starving knights. Your men have eaten their horses, then the rats, then their boots. Your scouts bring news that freezes blood in dying veins, not 40,000 enemies as you feared. 80,000 of Islam's finest warriors, spreading across the valley like a flood of iron. That is 266 enemies for every knight who can still lift a sword. The mathematics of annihilation are absolute, yet in 48 hours, this starving garrison will shatter the greatest Muslim army ever assembled against Christendom. 300 skeletons will crush 80,000. History will call it impossible. Survivors will call it God. Rewind 8 months, October 1097. The first crusade arrives at Antioch, and every man who sees those walls feels his courage drain into the Syrian dust. Picture it. Walls 60 feet high, carved from living rock, 400 towers bristling with Turkish archers, 25 miles of fortification snaking across mountain and valley alike. This city had not fallen to siege in over 1,000 years. The Romans tried, the Persians tried, the Arabs tried, all failed. Now 30,000 exhausted crusaders and 4,500 knights stand before these walls after marching 2,000 miles across hostile territory, and they face an impossible equation. They cannot take Antioch. The walls are too strong and the garrison too determined, but they cannot leave Antioch either. The city controls the only road to Jerusalem. Turn back, and the crusade dies in shame. Stay, and the crusade dies in blood. What happened next would kill 9 out of 10 of them. The men who would decide the fate of Christendom in the East were a collection of rivals who despised each other almost as much as they hated the Turks. Bohemond of Taranto stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5 feet 6 inches. This Norman giant had already defeated Byzantine armies through a combination of tactical brilliance and utter ruthlessness. He wanted Antioch for himself, and everyone knew it. Raymond of Toulouse was his opposite in every way. Wealthy beyond measure and pious to the point of fanaticism, this one-eyed count had financed much of the crusade from his own treasury. He watched Bohemond with the suspicion of a man who recognizes a predator. Godfrey of Bouillon had sold his entire duchy to fund his journey east. An idealist who genuinely believed God had called him to liberate Jerusalem. He tried to mediate between the feuding lords, while his own forces dwindled. Adhemar of Le Puy was the spiritual heart of everything. The papal legate carried a simple wooden crucifix that pilgrims claimed could heal the sick. More practically, he carried the authority of Pope Urban II himself. Without Adhemar, the crusade was just another army of invaders. With him it was a holy mission. Inside Antioch waited Yagi Sian, the Turkish governor who had held the city for 2 decades through cunning and calculated brutality. He watched the crusaders arrive and smiled. He had seen would-be conquerors before. The vultures always picked their bones clean eventually. These Christian lords despised each other. They argued over command, over strategy, over the future division of conquests they had not yet made. They would need to become brothers to survive what was coming. The first winter broke them. November rains transformed the crusader camps into lakes of freezing mud. Men who had marched through summer heat now shivered in tents that leaked and collapsed. Then came the diseases. Dysentery struck first, turning strong warriors into hollow-eyed wretches who soiled themselves where they lay. Typhoid followed, bringing fever and delirium. Unknown plagues swept through the camps, killing men who showed no symptoms at dawn and were corpses by nightfall. Food supplies collapsed with terrifying speed. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare within weeks. Foraging parties that ventured too far were slaughtered by Turkish cavalry, who knew every valley and ambush point. The crusaders began eating their horses. Then horse became a luxury, and they ate mules, donkeys, camels. Then those vanished too. Men fought over rat carcasses. Knights sold their armor for bread. Leather straps and belts were boiled into bitter soup. Some whispered of darker meals, but the chronicles fall silent on such horrors. Desertion became epidemic. Men who had crossed oceans and mountains for God slipped away in the night, preferring the shame of retreat to certain death. Even Peter the Hermit, the fiery preacher whose visions had helped inspire the entire crusade, fled into the darkness. Soldiers found him hiding in the hills and dragged him back in chains. If Peter the Hermit had lost faith, what hope did common soldiers have? By spring of 1098, over 15,000 crusaders had died without a single Muslim blade touching them. Disease, starvation, and despair had accomplished what Turkish arrows could not. The army that had arrived 30,000 strong now numbered barely half that, and most survivors could hardly stand. And then word came that made starvation seem merciful. Kurboga, the mighty Atabeg of Mosul, was assembling an army, not a raiding force, not a relief column, an army of annihilation. 80,000 warriors drawn from every corner of the Islamic world were marching toward Antioch. The mathematics of doom had arrived, and they were absolute. June 2nd, 1098. For 8 months the Crusaders had starved and died before walls that mocked their suffering. Now in the darkness of a moonless night, Bohemond of Taranto played his final card. For weeks he had conducted secret negotiations with a man named Firuz, an Armenian Christian who commanded a section of Antioch's southern wall. Firuz had converted to Islam years ago, but his faith had proven shallow and his grievances deep. Yagi Sian had recently fined him for hoarding grain, and the insult burned. Bohemond promised him wealth, lands, and revenge. Just after midnight, Firuz lowered a leather ladder from the tower of the Two Sisters. 60 hand-picked knights climbed in absolute silence. One cough, one clatter of armor, and every man would die. They reached the top. Firuz opened the gate, and hell poured into Antioch. The Crusaders flooded through the streets like starving wolves. 8 months of suffering transformed into 8 hours of slaughter. Turkish defenders woke to find enemies already inside their homes. Street fighting raged from quarter to quarter, but the outcome was never in doubt. Surprise and fury overwhelmed discipline and numbers. Yagi Sian, the cunning governor who had smiled at so many failed sieges, fled on horseback as his city burned. His horse threw him in the mountains, and local Armenians found him dazed and bleeding. They cut off his head and brought it to Bohemond as a gift. By dawn on June 3rd, the impregnable city belonged to the Crusaders. Men who had eaten rats and boiled leather now stumbled through streets paved with the bodies of their enemies. They found food, they found gold, they found wine. For one delirious night, they celebrated a victory that should have been impossible, but Bohemond did not celebrate. While his men drank and looted, he stood on the walls staring east. His scouts had reported what the celebrating army did not yet know. Kurboga of Mosul was 2 days away. The Crusaders had taken Antioch just in time to be trapped inside it. The nightmare was just beginning. Kurboga was no ordinary commander. The Atabeg of Mosul had spent 30 years conquering and governing, and he approached war with the cold precision of a chess master. When the Caliph of Baghdad commanded him to destroy the Crusader invasion, Kurboga summoned every ally, every vassal, every ambitious emir who wanted favor with the Caliph. They came from everywhere. From Damascus came Dukak with 5,000 cavalry, proud warriors who traced their lineage to the companions of the Prophet. From Aleppo came Ridwan with another 8,000, including siege engineers who had broken Byzantine fortresses. From Homs and Hama came 6,000 more, mixed forces of Turkish horse archers and Arab infantry. From the east came the elite Seljuk regiments, 10,000 warriors who had crushed every army sent against them for 50 years. Persians arrived with their famous armored cavalry. Kurdish mountain fighters joined, seeking plunder and glory. Regiment after regiment, banner after banner, until 80,000 warriors spread across the plains like a sea of iron and silk. June 4th brought Kurboga's vanguard to the walls of Antioch. June 5th brought his main cavalry. June 6th brought his infantry. June 7th brought siege equipment, supply trains, and the final contingents. By the time the last units arrived, the Muslim host encircled Antioch completely. Every gate was watched, every wall was threatened, every escape route was sealed. Inside those walls, the Crusaders faced a nightmare wrapped in mathematics. Of the 30,000 soldiers who had arrived 8 months earlier, perhaps 20,000 still breathed. But breathing and fighting are different things. Starvation had hollowed these men into walking corpses. Disease had weakened muscles and clouded minds. Of the 4,500 knights who had ridden to Antioch, fewer than 300 could still mount a horse. Most horses were dead anyway, eaten during the siege. Of the infantry, Perhaps 2,000 could hold a weapon without collapsing. The rest were dying, wounded, or so weakened that standing exhausted them. Against 80,000, that was 266 enemies for every knight who could still sit a saddle, 40 enemies for every Christian who could lift a sword. And Kerboga had food, he had water, he had time. All he needed to do was wait, and starvation would finish what his armies had not yet started. June 8th through June 14th became the week when hope died. The Crusaders had taken Antioch, but Antioch had nothing left to give. 8 months of siege had starved the city as thoroughly as the besiegers. Granaries stood empty, wells ran dry, the corpses of the massacre began rotting in the summer heat, and flies swarmed in black clouds. Men who had celebrated victory 3 days earlier now faced the same death they had feared outside the walls. Only now the walls that had kept them out were keeping them in. The last war horses were slaughtered for meat. Knights wept as they killed animals that had carried them from France, from Normandy, from Italy. The meat was divided into portions so small they barely sustained life. Leather saddles were boiled, grass was pulled from between paving stones. Some men caught dogs and rats, others simply stopped eating and lay down to wait for death. Desertions reached catastrophic levels. Every night men lowered themselves from the walls on ropes made from torn clothing. Some tried to slip through Kerboga's lines. Most were captured, and their screams echoed back to the city as Turkish torturers extracted information. Others surrendered directly, hoping conversion to Islam might spare their lives. Kerboga's terms were consistent. Convert or die, most died. The worst desertion came from the highest ranks. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest lords in the crusade, gathered his entire contingent and fled north. On the road he encountered Emperor Alexios of Byzantium, marching south with a relief army of 20,000 fresh troops. Stephen told the emperor what he had seen. "The crusade is finished," he reported. "Antioch has fallen to Kerboga. Every Christian inside those walls is dead or dying. There is nothing left to save." Alexios believed him. The Byzantine army turned around and marched back to Constantinople. 20,000 reinforcements that might have changed everything vanished over the horizon because one coward could not face his duty. It remains one of the greatest intelligence failures in military history. Inside Antioch, the survivors knew nothing of this betrayal. They only knew that each morning brought fewer men able to stand, fewer prayers that seemed to reach heaven, fewer reasons to believe they would see another sunrise. Priests heard confessions continuously, lines of dying men waiting to make peace with God before the end. Some confessed sins decades old. Others simply wept and asked why God had led them across the world to die in a foreign city surrounded by enemies. The question hung over everything. Why had God called them here? Why had he granted them victory over the walls, only to trap them inside? Why did he not answer their prayers, their fasting, their desperate pleas for deliverance? Raymond of Toulouse, too sick to stand most days, ordered continuous prayer services in every church. Adama of Le Puy celebrated Mass 3 times daily. Monks and priests processed through streets thick with corpses and despair, carrying relics and chanting psalms. Nothing changed. The sun rose on 80,000 enemies and set on starvation and disease. Modern medical analysis of the Chronicles suggests what the Crusaders endured. Advanced protein-calorie malnutrition would have caused muscle wasting, cognitive impairment, and immune system collapse. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency brought bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and wounds that refused to heal. Typhoid and dysentery continued claiming lives daily. Many survivors would have been experiencing visual disturbances, confusion, and hallucinations from starvation and fever. These were not soldiers. These were the dying surrounded by the dead, waiting for an enemy that did not even need to attack. All Kerboga had to do was wait a few more weeks, and he could walk into Antioch unopposed, stepping over corpses that starvation had created. The crusade was finished. Everyone knew it. And then a peasant named Peter Bartholomew began to dream. Peter Bartholomew was nobody, a peasant from Provence who could neither read nor write. He had joined the crusade as a servant to a minor pilgrim and survived the siege through sheer luck and stubbornness. He was thin, dirty, unremarkable in every way. The great lords did not know his name. The knights passed him without seeing. He was one of thousands of anonymous pilgrims who followed the army, hoping to reach Jerusalem before they died. But in the second week of June, 1098, Peter began to dream. The first vision came on the night of June 10th. Peter lay fevered and starving in a corner of the city when a figure appeared before him, bathed in light. The figure identified himself as St. Andrew, brother of St. Peter, apostle of Christ. Andrew spoke with terrible urgency. Beneath the cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch lay buried the Holy Lance, the very spear that the Roman soldier Longinus had thrust into the side of Christ on Calvary. "Find it," Andrew commanded. "Carry it into battle. Victory will follow." Peter woke trembling and dismissed the vision as fever dream. Who would believe a peasant claiming messages from apostles? The lords would laugh. The priests would accuse him of blasphemy or madness. He told no one. The second vision came the next night. St. Andrew returned, angrier now. "Why have you not spoken?" The third night brought a third vision, and now the apostle warned of consequences. "Speak or be cursed." Still Peter hesitated. His fear of ridicule outweighed his fear of divine punishment. A peasant approaching the great lords with tales of buried relics would be beaten or ignored or both. The fourth vision terrified him. Andrew showed Peter the battlefield to come, showed him crusader corpses piled like cordwood, showed him Kerboga's warriors triumphant, all because you remained silent. The apostle thundered. The fifth vision broke him. On June 14th, Peter Bartholomew sought an audience with Raymond of Toulouse. The one-eyed count was bedridden with illness, but he received the trembling peasant. Peter stammered through his story, expecting mockery at every sentence. Instead, Raymond listened with growing intensity. When Peter finished, Raymond summoned Adhemar of Le Puy. The papal legate was skeptical. Visions were common in desperate times, and peasants were susceptible to hysteria and deception. Yet Adhemar could not dismiss the possibility entirely. The cathedral dedicated to St. Peter stood at the heart of Antioch. If any holy relic lay hidden in the city, that ancient church was the logical place. Bohemond reacted with pure cynicism when he learned of the vision, a convenient revelation, he remarked, that promised victory to an army facing annihilation. Too convenient, perhaps, but even Bohemond could not oppose investigation. The army was dying, faith was collapsing. Even those who doubted wondered what did they have to lose. On the morning of June 15th, 12 men began digging beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. They broke through flagstones that had lain undisturbed for centuries. They dug through packed earth and rubble. Hour after hour they excavated, passing buckets of dirt hand to hand, while Peter Bartholomew watched and prayed. Morning became afternoon. The pit grew deeper, 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet. Nothing emerged but dirt and fragments of ancient brick. Whispers began circulating among the watchers. The peasant had lied. The vision was false. Some men laughed bitterly, others cursed. A few threw dirt at Peter, who shrank against the cathedral wall. Afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening. The diggers were exhausted and losing faith. Adhemar's expression had hardened into disappointment. Even Raymond looked uncertain. The pit was now 12 feet deep and had produced nothing but mockery and despair. Then Peter Bartholomew did something unexpected. He stripped off his outer garments and lowered himself into the pit. For long minutes he scratched at the earth with his bare hands, while men above watched in silence. Some pitied him, others prepared fresh insults. Then Peter's hands closed on something. He lifted it into the fading light. An iron lance point, corroded with age, but unmistakable in shape. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Men who had been mocking fell to their knees. Hardened knights who had faced death without flinching began to weep. Adhemar crossed himself. Raymond of Toulouse stretched out trembling hands to receive the relic. Was it genuine? Was it planted? Had Peter somehow concealed it on his person and produced it at the critical moment? Historians have debated these questions for 9 centuries. Adhemar himself apparently harbored private doubts. Some chroniclers suggest he believed the entire episode was staged, possibly by Raymond's faction seeking to boost morale and influence. The lance point itself was crude, perhaps ancient, perhaps merely old. No definitive proof of authenticity ever emerged. But here is what cannot be debated. Something happened in that cathedral that transformed a dying army into something else entirely. Men who had lost all hope suddenly found it burning in their chests. The news spread through Antioch faster than plague had spread through their camps. The Holy Lance. God has sent us the Holy Lance. Warriors too weak to stand found strength to kneel in prayer. Men who had whispered of surrender now spoke of attack. The relic may have been genuine or false, but its effect was absolutely real. Something fundamental shifted in the psychology of those starving men. Raymond of Toulouse took custody of the lance and swore to carry it into battle himself, despite illness that had kept him bedridden for days. Adhemar, whatever his private doubts, recognized the transformation occurring around him and did not oppose it. 3 days of fasting and prayer were proclaimed. This was almost darkly humorous, since the army had nothing to eat anyway. But the declaration transformed physical suffering into spiritual discipline. Men who had been starving were now fasting. Men who had been dying in despair were now sacrificing for God. The distinction was psychological, but it was everything. Confessions resumed with new fervor. Priests who had exhausted themselves hearing final admissions of sin now heard vows of courage and dedication. Knights sharpened swords they had been too weak to lift. Infantry bound their wounds and tested legs that had barely carried them. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. On June 27th, the Lords held council and made a decision that defied every principle of military logic. They would attack, not defend, not negotiate, not wait for starvation to finish them. They would open the gates of Antioch and charge 80,000 enemies with the 300 knights who could still ride and the 2,000 infantry who could still walk. The mathematics remained impossible. 266 enemies for every mounted knight. The outcome should have been as predictable as sunrise. But these men no longer calculated odds. They had passed beyond reason into something older and more powerful, faith or madness or both. The night of June 27th felt sacred and terrible. Priests blessed weapons that would taste blood tomorrow or rust over their owners' corpses. Final communions were offered to men who expected to meet their Creator within hours, those who could write dictated last letters to families across the sea, those who could not simply prayed and wept and embraced brothers they would die beside. No one slept. No one wanted to. These last hours of life were too precious to waste on darkness and dreams. Dawn came bloody red, the sun rising through smoke and dust. The gates of Antioch groaned open. 300 skeletal knights on horses, barely alive, formed into ranks. Behind them, 2,000 infantry in armor that hung loose on starving frames, lifted weapons that seemed too heavy for their wasted arms. Raymond of Toulouse carried on a litter because he could not walk, clutched the holy lance wrapped in silk. Adhemar of Le Puy rode at the head of his division, carrying the crucifix that pilgrims believed could work miracles. Across the plain Kerbagas, 80,000 waited. Their banners stretched to the horizon. Their drums made the earth tremble. Their confidence was absolute. They had only to sweep aside these scarecrows, and Jerusalem would fall within the month. As the sun rose on June 28th, 300 skeletons prepared to charge an empire. The gates of Antioch swung open at dawn, and what emerged should have provoked laughter from any professional soldier watching. 6 divisions of walking corpses arranged themselves on the plain before the bridge gate. Hugh of Vermandois led the 1st Division, brother to the King of France, now reduced to commanding perhaps 300 men who could barely stand. Godfrey of Bouillon led the 2nd with his brother Baldwin, their combined forces numbering fewer than 400. Robert of Normandy commanded the 3rd, son of William the Conqueror, now leading 350 scarecrows in rusted mail. Adhemar of Le Puy rode at the head of the 4th Division, the papal legate carrying his wooden crucifix like a battle standard, while perhaps 400 men followed on legs that trembled with each step. The 5th and 6th Divisions belonged to Tancred and Robert of Flanders, another 500 between them. Behind them all waited Bohemond of Taranto, with the reserve, 200 knights on horses that swayed with exhaustion. In total, perhaps 2,300 men emerged from Antioch that morning. Raymond of Toulouse remained inside the city, too ill to fight, but clutching the Holy Lance and guarding against any Muslim force that might attempt to storm the walls during the battle. Across the Orontes plain, Kerboga watched from his command position on the hillside. What he saw made him smile. These Christians looked like corpses that had forgotten to lie down. Their horses were skeletal, their armor hanging loose on wasted frames, their formations ragged with weakness. His scouts had reported that the enemy was starving, but seeing it confirmed filled him with contempt. His advisers urged immediate attack. Crush them now while they are forming. One emir counseled, do not let them fully deploy. But Kerbogha waved away such caution. Let them all come out, he reportedly said. Let them see the army that will destroy them. Let their despair be complete before we finish them. This arrogance would cost 20,000 lives. The Crusader formation advanced slowly across the dusty plain. Each step was agony for men whose muscles had consumed themselves for fuel. Horses stumbled on ground that healthy mounts would have crossed at a canter. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on metal armor, turning each man into a furnace of suffering. But they kept coming. Muslim horse archers began their deadly work. Turkish cavalry swept along the flanks, loosing arrows in sheets that darkened the air. Crusaders fell, pierced through gaps in armor, or struck in faces and throats. But the infantry raised their shields, and the survivors pressed forward. They had come too far and suffered too much to die retreating. Each man understood with perfect clarity that there was no going back. The only path was forward through 80,000 enemies, or into paradise trying. Kerbogha finally ordered his general assault. The great mass of Muslim cavalry began rolling forward, a wave of iron and horseflesh that should have crushed the Christian line like an avalanche crushing saplings. The ground shook with the thunder of 50,000 hooves. Dust clouds rose so thick that men could barely see the sun. This was the moment when the impossible began. Kerbogha's army was not truly an army. It was a coalition, a gathering of rivals forced together by the Caliph's command, but united by nothing except orders they resented. Dukak of Damascus had nursed grudges against Kerbogha for years. Ridwan of Aleppo had only joined under pressure. The Persian contingents had their own ambitions. The Turkish factions distrusted the Arab factions, who despised the Kurdish factions. They were enemies pretending to be allies. As the assault began, Dukak of Damascus suddenly wheeled his 5,000 cavalry away from the battle. He had seen enough. If Kerbogha won, Damascus would gain nothing, and Mosul would gain everything. If Kerbogha lost, Damascus would be blamed for supporting him. Better to preserve his forces for the political struggles to come. His banners streaming behind him, Dukak led his entire contingent off the field. Other emirs saw this and hesitated. If Damascus was withdrawing, was defeat possible? Should they commit fully, or preserve their own forces? The great assault that should have swept the Crusaders into oblivion fragmented into a series of uncoordinated attacks. Some units charged, others held back, others began edging toward escape routes. The Crusaders kept coming, despite arrows, despite charges, despite everything military logic said should stop them. Men who could barely lift their swords lifted them anyway. Men who could barely walk walked anyway. They had the Holy Lance behind them, and Christ before them, and nothing in between mattered. Bohemond watched from the reserve with the cold eye of a master tactician. He saw the Muslim left flank engage heavily with Adhemar's division, pushing the papal legate back toward the river. He saw the Muslim right flank hesitate, uncertain whether to commit fully given Dukak's withdrawal. He saw the exact moment when Kerbogha's center was fully engaged, and his flanks were exposed. Bohemond struck. 200 knights thundered forward, every remaining ounce of strength in their dying horses channeled into one final charge. They hit the Muslim right flank like a hammer striking glass. The impact was devastating beyond all proportion to their numbers. These were the last Norman knights, veterans of campaigns from Sicily to Byzantium, men who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. They carved through the hesitating Muslim cavalry like a blade through silk. The psychological effect was catastrophic. Warriors who had been uncertain whether to fight suddenly decided to flee. The collapse cascaded through Kerbogha's army like a wave. Regiment after regiment broke, each fleeing unit spreading panic to those around it. Within minutes the assault had transformed into a rout, and the rout was transforming into a disaster. Kerbogha himself screamed commands that no one obeyed. His officers tried to rally their men, but men who run rarely stopped to listen. The great coalition army shattered into fragments racing in every direction. The cream of Persian, Turkish, and Arab military power dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals seeking only escape, and the Crusaders pursued. This defies all explanation. Men who had been too weak to lift their swords an hour ago now found strength to chase fleeing enemies for miles. Horses that had been stumbling at a walk now galloped after victims. It was as if 8 months of suffering had been compressed into a single explosion of fury and release. Muslim warriors were cut down by the hundreds, by the thousands. The banks of the Orontes River became slaughterhouses as fleeing men tried to cross and were caught in the shallows. Bodies piled so thick in places that the living climbed over the dead, trying to escape. Kerbogha's own bodyguard abandoned him, and the great Atabeg of Mosul fled on the fastest horse he could find, leaving behind his treasury, his weapons, his supplies, everything. The pursuit continued until exhaustion finally ended. What willpower could no longer sustain, Crusader horses collapsed and died, having given their last strength. Knights fell from their saddles, unable to move another inch. Infantry dropped where they stood. Weapons still clutched in cramping hands, but they had won. When the counting was done, the scale of victory defied comprehension. Over 20,000 Muslim dead carpeted the plains around Antioch. Kerbogha's entire treasury fell into Crusader hands, along with weapons enough to equip an army 3 times their size. Food supplies intended to sustain 80,000 men for months became salvation for 2,000 survivors. The Crusaders had lost perhaps 200 men in the battle itself, losses so light compared to the enemy dead that chroniclers struggled to believe their own tallies. As evening painted the sky red, Raymond of Toulouse emerged from Antioch, carrying the Holy Lance. The dying count walked through fields of the dead to where his fellow lords waited among the carnage. No one had strength left for celebration. Men simply knelt where they were, surrounded by corpses, and wept. Priests led prayers of thanksgiving, but many could not speak through their tears. They had asked God for deliverance, and deliverance had come in a form so total that it shattered understanding. Raymond lifted the Holy Lance toward the setting sun, and thousands of voices, hoarse with thirst and exhaustion, whispered the words together. Non nobis Domin, not unto us, O Lord, not unto us but unto thy name give glory. They remained kneeling until darkness covered the field, when they finally rose and began gathering supplies from the enemy dead. Some men laughed, and some men sobbed, and most did both. They found bread, they found meat, they found water. For the first time in months, they ate until they were full. That night, Crusaders slept among mountains of captured treasure, their bellies satisfied, their wounds dressed, their faith confirmed beyond all doubt. But victory carried its own costs. Adhemar of Le Puy, the spiritual heart of the crusade, had survived the battle only to fall to typhoid 1 month later on August 1st, 1098. The papal legate who had held the fractious lords together, who had blessed their weapons and heard their confessions and carried his crucifix into battle, died surrounded by men who owed him everything. His loss would haunt the crusade for years. Without his moral authority, the lords would return to squabbling over spoils and territory. The unity forged in desperation would fracture in victory. But that was tomorrow's tragedy. Tonight the road to Jerusalem lay open. The greatest army Islam had assembled in generations had been destroyed by 300 knights, too starving to lift their swords, and 2,000 infantry too weak to walk. Tomorrow they would bury their dead and tend their wounded and argue about what came next. But tonight, on this field of 20,000 corpses, they knew that something impossible had happened, something no historian could fully explain, something that tasted like a miracle. 1 year after that bloody June evening, the Crusaders stood before Jerusalem. The march south had been brutal, more deaths from disease and skirmishes, more suffering that seemed to have no end. But on July 15th, 1099, the walls of the Holy City fell. Knights who had eaten rats at Antioch now wept as they walked through streets their Saviour had walked. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was born, along with the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli, 4 Crusader states carved from territory that Kerbogha's army should have defended. An entire political order in the Middle East was transformed because 300 starving men had charged 80,000 and somehow won. Kerbogha never recovered from his humiliation. The Atabeg of Mosul, who had commanded the greatest Muslim army in generations, returned home in disgrace, with barely 3,000 survivors, his reputation destroyed, his alliances shattered. He spent his remaining years watching his power crumble. Other emirs who had fled the battle faced similar fates. The Muslim world that had been slowly unifying under strong leadership fragmented once more. Rivalries that Kerbogha's authority had suppressed exploded into the open. Damascus distrusted Mosul. Aleppo feuded with both. The Crusader states would survive for nearly 2 centuries, in part because their enemies could never unite against them, the way Kerbogha had briefly united them before Antioch. The Holy Lance itself passed into legend and controversy. Raymond of Toulouse guarded it jealously, carrying it through the siege of Jerusalem and beyond. But doubts persisted. Adhemar had never fully believed. Other lords whispered that the discovery was too convenient, too perfectly timed. The relic's authenticity became a matter of bitter dispute. Peter Bartholomew, the peasant whose visions had started everything, grew tired of the whispers. In April 1099, he demanded trial by ordeal to prove the lance was genuine. A corridor of burning logs was constructed, and Peter walked through the flames. He emerged alive but horribly burned. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say the crowd rushed him in jubilation and crushed him. Others say his burns were fatal from the start. He died within days, and with him died certainty about the lance. The relic itself eventually disappeared from history. Some claim it was lost in later battles. Others say it was hidden in Constantinople, or Rome, or a dozen other places. Fragments claiming to be the true lance exist in Vienna, in the Vatican, in Echmiadzin. None can be authenticated. The mystery endures. Modern historians have proposed explanations for what happened at Antioch that require no divine intervention. Coalition politics clearly played a role. Dukak's withdrawal and the general disunity of Kerbogha's forces created vulnerabilities that Bohemond brilliantly exploited. Mass psychology offers another lens. The discovery of the lance, authentic or not, triggered a collective psychological transformation in men who had surrendered to despair. Starving soldiers who believed God fought beside them became capable of feats that starving soldiers who had lost hope could never achieve. Tactical genius deserves credit as well. Bohemond's timing of the reserve charge was masterful, exploiting the exact moment when Muslim hesitation created an opening. The decision to attack rather than defend caught Kerbogha off guard and prevented him from using his numerical advantage in a siege. Yet something resists complete explanation. How did horses near death from starvation find strength to charge and pursue for miles? How did men who could barely lift swords an hour before the battle suddenly fight with fury that shattered veterans? How did 300 knights break 80,000 warriors so completely that 20,000 died and the rest fled in terror? The mathematics remain impossible. Coalition fractures and brilliant tactics can explain much, but they cannot explain everything. Both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, writing in the years after the battle, used similar language. They spoke of something beyond normal warfare, something that defied the rules they understood. Ibn al-Athir, the great Muslim historian, called it a catastrophe that made no sense. Christian writers claimed angels rode beside the Crusaders, saints visible on the battlefield, striking down the enemies of God. Skeptics dismissed such accounts as propaganda or religious enthusiasm. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the battle can be reduced to politics and psychology and tactical opportunity. Perhaps the Holy Lance was fraud, and the victory was luck, and the impossible mathematics were simply improbable, rather than miraculous. But stand for a moment on that plain outside Antioch as the sun sets on June 28th, 1098. Look at 300 skeletal knights kneeling in prayer, their rusted armor splashed with blood, their starving horses collapsed around them. Look at 20,000 corpses carpeting the earth in every direction. An army that should have swept these Christians into oblivion, scattered instead, like chaff before wind. Watch Raymond of Toulouse raise the Holy Lance toward the dying sun, iron point dark against crimson sky, while 2,000 survivors whisper thanks to a God they are certain answered their prayers. Stand there and tell yourself it was only politics, only psychology, only luck. The witnesses knew what they had seen, even if they could not explain it. The survivors lived the rest of their lives marked by that day, unable to forget the moment when impossible became inevitable. They had asked God for a miracle, and something had answered. Whether that something was divine intervention, or human courage pushed beyond all known limits, or simply the strange mathematics of despair transformed into fury, no one could say with certainty. Perhaps the question itself misses the point. Some battles are won by swords, some by strategy, some by the cold calculation of politics and the hot chaos of psychology, and some, perhaps, by something no historian can fully explain. The siege of Antioch was all of these, and something more. 300 starving knights charged 80,000 warriors and won. The impossible happened. Everything that followed, the kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader states, 2 centuries of history in the Holy Land, flowed from that single afternoon when faith or madness or divine intervention, or all three together, shattered an empire and changed the world. The mystery endures because the facts resist resolution. What happened at Antioch on June 28, 1098, cannot be explained away and cannot be explained fully. It can only be witnessed across 9 centuries of history, a moment when the rules seemed to break, when the mathematics failed, when something happened that still makes us wonder. And perhaps that wondering is the point. Perhaps some events are meant to remain mysterious, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is larger than our categories can contain. 300 against 80,000, starvation against plenty, despair transformed into victory. The Crusaders called it miracle, the Muslims called it catastrophe. History calls it the Battle of Antioch, and the question of what really happened that day still hangs in the air like incense, like prayer, like the dust of 80,000 hooves frozen forever, in a moment when everything changed.